Hello, everyone. This is Eva Nolik-Smith with Yoga U Online, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Dr. Baxter Bell, a medical doctor and a yoga therapist and yoga teacher, and now author. Baxter has a long history with yoga. It was a love affair to begin back in 1993 while he was still working full-time as a family doctor. And his appreciation then for the potential of yoga for fostering health and healing was so great that he decided eventually to stop his medical practice and become a full-time yoga teacher. And Baxter is now just teaching yoga full-time. He is also teaching yoga and workshops nationally, yoga workshops nationally and internationally. And he is a leading figure in helping to develop the field of yoga therapy. Baxter is on the board of the International Association of Yoga Therapy and also co-founder and writer for the popular Yoga for Healthy Aging blog. And the most recent addition to Baxter's many accomplishments is his new book on Yoga for Healthy Aging, which was published by Shambhala Press. About, what is it, a little bit less than a year ago, Baxter?
December of 2017. And I want to mention that Nina Zolotov was my co-author on that.
Yes, with Nina Zolotov, who is also one of the co-founders of the Healthy Aging blog, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and congratulations on that huge achievement. I can only imagine how much work it was because it's such a wonderful book. It contains so much material on relevant on yoga for healthy aging and the bonus essential yoga poses for healthy aging. So great job on that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So welcome to you. And we're here to talk not just about healthy aging, but about a condition that is getting increasing attention from the medical condition. And it's a condition of the medical, sorry, I'm going to clip that one here. So welcome, Baxter.
Thank you.
So we're here to talk not just about healthy aging, but about a new condition that is receiving increasing attention from the medical community. Mm-hmm. And it is a condition that when you read about it, you come away with this feeling that this is a key issue to focus on to prevent all other health issues. The one condition to end all your health problems. Right. And so, of course,
the one factor we might be able to influence, right?
Yes, exactly. And so we're talking, of course, about inflammation, which is a new buzzword, and it is now considered a precursor to anything from Alzheimer's to heart disease, diabetes, thyroid issues, arthritis, and so on. Could you talk about cancer? Really?
In fact, I was just looking at a review article that was talking about the increased incidence of colon cancer in adult men who are moderate to overweight and lean women, and also to men and women who don't drink alcohol. Those groups of people are at higher risk of underlying inflammation leading to an increased risk in colon cancer. So our understanding day by day expands in getting a sense of what happens with inflammation and also how it impacts our health or our poor health, right? Mm. So it's, it has appropriate roles in our health and it has inappropriate roles in our overall well-being as well.
Yeah. And we're talking about chronic inflammation. It's when the inflammation response becomes chronic that most issues arise. Is that correct?
That's correct. And something that's also come to light for me as I've been diving into all of the research that's going on around this topic is that there's now actually a new term. It turns out that aging itself, getting older day by day, increases the chances of chronic inflammation being present in the body. And it's called inflammaging. Inflammation combined with aging, it's now called inflammaging. is a technical term that's now being used in research literature and in studies to describe this process of advancing age and increasing chance of chronic inflammation. So age itself is a risk factor for developing inflammation
Right,
on a
yeah.
chronic level, which is, we can't change the fact that we're getting older. We might be able to influence maybe some of the other factors that go on when it comes to chronic inflammation.
Yeah, and it is really fascinating because age, getting older, of course, is also a risk factor for all these other
Right.
chronic
They go hand
diseases.
in hand, don't they?
It
Yeah.
goes hand in hand, and so it's really interesting that if you are able to address inflammation, that might be the one thing that would also help all
Yeah.
these other things.
Yeah.
But could you, it's always been a little bit of a mystery for me how this works. I mean, how would chronic inflammation, pay into so many different diseases?
Yeah.
What are the
It-
mechanics?
Yeah, it's actually pretty complex. And, I would say that, I'm beginning to become clearer and clearer the more time I spend with this on what's happening. But it seems like the presence of the chronic inflammation acts as a trigger for other systems to go haywire. For instance, the presence of chronic inflammation affects the messaging around how insulin functions. So it increases the chances of insulin resistance. And if that exists long enough, of course, then it increases the chance that you're going to get type 2 diabetes. And if you get type 2 diabetes, then it increases your chances of getting metabolic syndrome. And then it increases your chances of strokes and heart attacks. So it's kind of a cascade that takes place. But one of the initial precipitators is the presence of the inflammation. The inflammation can increase the number of radicalized oxygen molecules in our body. So it seems to have an effect on creating more of that sort of molecule in the body. It seems to disrupt the normal immune function in the body. So it affects the way white blood cells respond to, normal circumstances in the body. So they don't operate normally anymore. So that might then contribute to the development of more autoimmune problems down the road. But it's the inflammation affecting immune molecules that can cause problems. The inflammation also seems to impact the genetic expression of some of our genes and our cells of our body. And so the inflammation then acts as kind of what we call has an epigenetic effect, because it affects what genes get turned on and what genes get turned off, that then can accelerate the aging process or trigger a disease process in turn, increasing the chances of those things happening. So my understanding is that it actually is fairly complex in how it interacts with all these different aspects of our normal functioning body, switching things into more of an abnormal function and therefore leading to problems down the road.
Very interesting. As you were talking, it really reminded me of the Ayurvedic concept of ama. Ama as a byproduct of the metabolic process in the body, a particularly incomplete metabolic process, and they describe it as kind of like this gunk that gets in the system and kind of clogs up and messes up things. It doesn't have any correlation with toxins, impurities in the body, or is it, what are the factors that precipitates inflammation?
Well, one thing you just said kind of reminded me of another maybe example in the central nervous system, and that is, when you have neurons that die over time with the aging process, they break down in the brain, right? So if the brain effectively can clear that material out, it's not problematic. But if you don't have efficient cleansing on a daily basis, usually while we're asleep, then you get the accumulation of this material. You could call it ama if you wanted, but technically it's the breakdown of these cells. And that creates an inflammatory process in the brain. So, again, it's interesting how it seems almost like a little bit of the chicken and the egg. If the system's operating correctly, inflammation gets removed, inflammatory markers drop down, and, the inflammation doesn't seem to be as much of a factor as if levels remain high.
Right.
We know that, for instance, that stressful situations in our lives tend to increase the inflammatory markers in our body, which seems to indicate there's a higher level of chronic inflammation present on a daily basis, right? So chronic stress contributes to chronic inflammation. And people who have depression also have higher inflammatory markers. And there's even some recent studies I know that Nina wrote about not too long ago on the blog that talk about inflammation may be actually the precipitator for depression developing. So is it inflammation that leads to depression, and that's why the inflammatory markers are high? Or the presence of depression causes inflammation that causes those markers to be high? So there's still some figuring out going on about this, but underlying all this is the presence of this chronic inflammation. So a couple things come to mind in terms of other risk factors are, again, stress, which we talk about a lot in Yoga for Healthy Aging, right? Because there's stress-related illness. They're all, when you step back and look at them, the illnesses that fall under stress-related illnesses and the illnesses that seem to be precipitated by inflammation, it's kind of the same group of problems that we're looking at, you know, heart disease, cancer, autoimmune diseases, dementia, cognitive changes. All these things are kind of again and again coming up, even though we've talked about them in the past as being these kind of entities that exist in a little box. It turns out that they may have the same seed from which they sprout. Does that make sense? So we know that the presence of stress, we know that the lack of physical activity, we know that dietary choices, huge impact on the presence of chronic inflammation. And we also know that because our behavior, our eating habits are impacting the choices that we make in terms of what we're taking in for many of us, not all of us, because there are that group of people who don't have the resources to buy good food if they would want to, right? So that's a whole nother group of people that where the issues of social justice and fairness and everything would impact their health and well-being when it comes to inflammation. But that diet and dietary choices have a big impact on the presence of inflammation in the body. And so, although, you know, and you know, the yogic tradition often talks about a good, healthy vegetarian diet. And it turns out that, you know, green leafy vegetables and dark yellow vegetables and more fruits and avoiding processed foods and, you know, all the junk food that and meats and things that have been shown to be pro-inflammatory in the body, that sometimes making those choices of adopting a yogic dietary lifestyle or even Ayurvedic lifestyle, where we're eating things that are less inflammatory, and avoiding things that are more common in our Western diet in terms of processed foods, fast foods, heavy on the meat and grains and low on the other things, that our yoga practices, and we'll get into this, I'm hoping, in our program nicely that's coming up at the end of August of 2018, that we'll get into some more of the nuts and bolts of that. I don't want to go into that too much today, but saying that, you know, diet is a big part of this whole formula. And our yoga practices can support better choices because we get better at self-regulating how we respond to stress and different factors, being rushed at work and this and that. We get better at self-regulating and making better choices. Right. So, you know, it's both complex and simple at the same time. You know, on some level, if we adopt the proper lifestyle choices, we will actually be able to impact and influence the levels of inflammation in our body to a certain extent. Yeah,
it's so interesting. Everything comes back to what Ayurveda refers to, like to the 4 pillars of health, right? Proper sleep, proper diet, proper exercise, and what am I missing?
Management of one's sexual energy, they often talk about, and the main things in Ayurveda.
Yeah, that's right.
That's one of the main things that you
and I guess stress management as well. So it's still a little bit of a mystery. The information process is, you know, gets triggered when we're fighting a bug, and, you know, when we cut ourselves, and, you know, we get bacteria. So
you're describing like the normal positive inflammatory response in our bodies that's integrated into how our immune system functions effectively.
Right. And that's pretty obvious because we all feel it. But how can we know if we have chronic inflammation going on?
Yeah, well, you and I were just talking about the continuum of health, right? Where we might feel like we're generally pretty healthy, but maybe we're a little sluggish on our energy levels. Maybe we have some mild aches and pains in the morning when we get up that get better when we move around. Maybe our skin is a little sensitive. Maybe our digestion is a little bit sensitive also, depending on what we eat. So, there aren't like really clear symptoms of inflammation that's at a low level and chronic. In fact, you could be I think most people are kind of chugging along in their lives with a certain level of low chronic inflammation, and they're not actually even aware of it. It might, again, contribute to some mild symptoms here or there, but it's not like suddenly getting the flu. Or it's not like even getting diabetes, where you could at least check, and know very easily with easy technology that, oh, my sugars are out of the normal range right now, right? It really requires, on some level, suspicion, or a savvy practitioner that you work with that is becoming more aware of the presence of chronic inflammation as an underlying factor in the development of poor health over time, to suggest that, we might look at seeing if there's some evidence that might be present in your body that could, point to the fact that maybe you are living with higher levels of inflammation. So, your Western doc will have some blood tests that they could order. They don't necessarily order it routinely at this time, but I think functional medicine physicians, who are kind of a new specialty that's been around for 10 or 15 years now, they're probably more likely to think of checking some of these inflammatory markers in the bloodstream or in the saliva, that then could give you a sense of, oh, maybe I'm actually not as healthy as I thought I was. And maybe it's time now to do something about it before I develop type 2 diabetes, or I develop osteoarthritis, or I start to have some difficulties with some autoimmune condition down the road, or I get the bad news when I go to the doc that there's evidence of blood in my stool, and maybe I have, some risk factors for colon cancer that I didn't know I had before. So that we can be a little more proactive, utilize our lifestyle tools as preventative medicine in a sense, and reverse maybe a process that hopefully hasn't been around for too long, but that we know that we can impact on some level.
Yeah, I know there was a medical doctor, Dr. Bredesen. I don't know if you heard about him, but he focused specifically on Alzheimer's, and he is one of the first. He kind of did for Alzheimer's what Dean Ornish did for heart disease, that he showed that it is possible to, not just slow the progression of Alzheimer's, but in some cases actually reverse it and see cognitive improvement in people with early stage Alzheimer's. And a key thing that he focuses on is, these inflammatory markers in the body, finding out, well, are there inflammatory markers? And if so, adjusting diet, adjusting, lifestyle routines to address those.
Yeah. And again, what I love about these approaches, and what I loved about Dean Ornish's approach, and I suspect this physician also, is you're using lifestyle options. It's not a pharmacology, it's not a surgical intervention, it's not a pill that you take that was developed in a laboratory. These are actually skills that you can teach yourself and learn, or have someone guide you through. In case of Alzheimer's, of course, you might need a lot of guidance and support initially, but as your cognition improves, probably you'll be able to remember your routines more on your own. But it's these are things that you can empower. We can empower others. They can empower themselves and share with others. And if we affect the health of one family member, ideally, the assumption would be that's probably going to start to filter out to other family members and friends, because they're going to go, "What have you done? You are looking great. You're telling me all these amazing things you're doing right now. Your health has obviously improved. What are you doing that I'm not doing?" Right? So the hope is that, this spreads not only from, those of us that have the information or sharing it, but then it spreads more evenly throughout the community in a nice organic way.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And of course, you and I are both passionate about yoga. So is there a role for yoga in this? Can yoga have an impact on the degree of inflammation in the body, or help curb it if it's already present?
Yes, it can. When I share this topic in the near future in our bigger program, I will share quite a bit of the research that's been done to date that helps to support the fact that yoga seems like a really good tool to help lower systemic inflammation on a chronic basis. I'll mention one thing that was really interesting. There was a study done that looked at about 50 women half of whom were new to practicing yoga and half of whom had been practicing for multiple years. And they, each person was, they tested them on 3 separate occasions, but they did lots of blood tests and things. So it was actually, when I thought about being one of the subjects of this study, I wouldn't have enjoyed it very much, because while I'm in reclining cobbler's pose, they're going to draw a sample of blood. And when I'm in the pose, they're going to draw another sample of blood. So there were like 3 different times during the session where they actually drew blood and got saliva samples. So, that alone would be pretty stressful.
Not a very relaxing practice, right?
But what they did is they subjected the individuals to a stressor before they did their yoga practice. And then while they did the yoga practice, they assessed these different things. What was interesting about just the 2 groups that they studied is at baseline, before they even did the study, they tested the levels of inflammatory markers. And they found that the novice yogis, the level of inflammatory markers were 44% higher than the experienced yogis.
Wow.
So right away you have evidence that, comparing 2 similar groups of people and looking at the one factor of, have you practiced yoga for less than 6 months or more than 4 years, that alone demonstrated a difference in some of the inflammatory markers in the bloodstream. So I'll get into more studies that help to show other benefits or other evidence that yoga practices can help manage inflammation. But in general, most of the studies looked at yoga asana practice, pranayama, and meditation as the 3 basic tools. Out of all the tools in our yoga toolbox, those were the things that were consistently used when studying yoga's effect on inflammation. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I've designed a nice practice that folks that tune into that module that we're going to share, that they'll actually get to do at home, that's really based on that information, right? So I really wanted to take advantage of the fact that we know that a combination of restorative and mildly active yoga poses, breath practices, and meditation techniques can be really excellent choices in your toolbox. And that doesn't mean that other things that you might use, such as sound practice and things like that, couldn't also have a benefit, but they may not have specifically been studied yet.
Right, right.
So the jury's out there, and my assumption is they're probably going to be beneficial, but we don't know for sure. We don't have that Western confirmation through Western style studies.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you made several references to your course coming up on yoga for chronic inflammation, and it is a course we're really excited about because I think it's a topic we hear about a lot about yoga for stress relief and yoga for this, yoga for that, but inflammation is something that a lot of people are not aware of. Yeah. And so I think learning more about what it is and what some of the different signs are of inflammation, what kind of blood tests you can run, and then more specifically, which are the different yoga approaches you can use, and how has yoga, what do we know already about yoga and how yoga affects inflammation?
Yeah.
So we're very excited about it. And you mentioned a number of things already that you'll be covering in the course. Are there any other things you want to do, like a brief overview of some of the highlights?
I'm certainly I would like to share with everyone a little better understanding of normal healthy inflammation briefly, and how that plays its role in a healthy immune system, because we know that chronic inflammation actually starts to mess up our immune system. It actually dysregulates our immune system on some level. So I think it's nice to have a little bit of simple foundational understanding of how that works. And then we'll talk about what chronic inflammation is, how it's monitored. Again, is it easy to tell just as an individual that I might have chronic inflammation? Because I think that's the tricky part. It can be almost a little bit like high blood pressure, where it's present in your system, but it hasn't reared its ugly head by causing some other problem yet, right? So this is one of those things where I think a little level of suspicion is a good thing to have. Being a little bit, hey, should I check this out and make sure it's something I need to worry about? It's, in some ways, when you think about the 23andMe movement, where people are getting their genetic code mapped out, it's like they want to have some information that gives them better guidance on where they want to put their time and energy in terms of health management, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that chronic inflammation may end up being something like that for our listeners, once they understand it a little bit more and get a sense of its broad impact on our overall health. So, we'll talk about the variety of things. You've already alluded to many of them, but I'll try and give a fairly complete list of the conditions that seem to arise out of the presence of chronic inflammation. And then we'll talk about those lifestyle tools in more detail, how we can apply them, how you can continue doing things you might already be doing that are really good for you. Because some of us that are going to be tuning in might already have a regular yoga practice. But as people I've known who have developed other health problems, like Victor Dubin, who's in our book, Yoga for Healthy Aging, at age 37, he found out that his blood pressure was really high, and he had a crazy family history of everybody developing high blood pressure. He was already doing yoga. He was already a regular runner. He already had a pretty good diet. And so he had to refine and retool his practice. And he decided to front load his practice with more meditation. So he was sure to do that every day. And then he also refined his running and his diet. And guess what? After about, a certain number of months, his blood pressure came down into the healthy range again, right? So he was already doing some good things for his health, but he had to refine them. So I'm maybe hoping that some of the information that I'll share will help those of us that are already involved in fairly good lifestyle habits. We can improve those when it comes to inflammation. And then for people who tune in that aren't very familiar with yoga and how it can be used, they'll have a little primer on how they can apply the yoga tools and some resources to do that, to implement that in their everyday lives.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a beautiful point about retooling the health habits you already have, because I think when you have a healthy lifestyle, it's easy to think, well, I'm already doing everything I can, but you're right, you can oftentimes be more specific in terms of accomplishing certain goals in health management and have quite a big impact. So,
huge impact,
yeah.
And I was just reading Beth Gibbs' contribution to the blog today, talking about energy levels. How do we maintain our energy level through the day and through different stages in our life? And she noted that, as she's gotten to be a little bit of an older adult, she's found that, the kind of vigorous yoga practice actually don't leave her energized when she's done. They don't actually work that way for her. So, kind of reassessing the practices what we're doing and the benefits we think we're getting, and then being honest and clear with what we're seeing, and then using that information to better guide us into the future.
Yeah.
Those are all kind of beneficial skills to have.
Principle of ahimsa, right?
Yes, ahimsa. Yeah.
Don't force your body.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Baxter, thank you so much for joining us to tell us about this exciting course.
And I'm excited.
Very much looking forward to it. Yeah.
Great.
Great. And everyone listening in, thanks so much for joining us. And if you want more information about Baxter, look for his courses on Yoga U Online. And you can also find his writings at the Yoga for Healthy Aging blog. What is it, yogaforhealthyaging.com? Or
it's yogaforhealthyaging.blogspot.com.
.blogs. Okay.
Yeah. If you put Baxter Bell and Yoga for Healthy Aging in a Google search, you're going to find it pretty quickly. It'll probably be on the first page of options. And then they can also check in at my website, which is baxterbell.com.
Yes.
That's a good place, good resource.
And then there's Amazon, Yoga for Healthy Aging, Baxter Bell book.
You can certainly find it on Amazon. Shambhala was wonderful and actually published our book. We actually have an actual publisher. So you can also go to their website and order the book from Shambhala Press.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Baxter, and enjoy the rest of your day. All right. Take care.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.